Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I wanted to go through some patch note changes that I think are quite important, but ones that are kind of either hidden in wrong sections of the patch notes where you wouldn't expect them to be, or ones that may have just been missed or even skipped over because they weren't particularly relevant at the time. But I think some of these changes are actually going to be quite impactful for most players during their Path of Exile gameplay, so I wanted to go through these changes in this video. Let's begin with this change to reflect modifiers in maps. And reflect has historically been this thing that people don't really want in the game, and now GGG are finally making a pretty big change to it. So reflect as we know it is going away, and there's going to be a new system where monsters can have modifiers for physical or elemental thorns. And the way that's going to work is this is basically a monster buff that gets activated when they get hit by that type of damage. So for example, when a monster with physical thorns as their modifier gets hit by physical damage, they actually activate a buff on themselves that lasts for 5 seconds, and each hit they take will deal a hit of damage back to the attacker, and that hit of damage will be a flat amount. You can see there in red maps is going to be 800 reflected physical damage for the physical thorns modifier and 1500 reflected elemental damage of the elemental type that was dealt for the elemental thorns modifier. Now there's a couple of really important things about this particular change that I think is going to impact how thorns are dealt with now, with the biggest one being that you can only take physical or elemental thorns damage once every 0.1 seconds. You are going to be able to react in time, especially if you have ways to mitigate the incoming damage. For example, the reflected 1500 damage there is only going to deal 375 damage to you if you have your elemental resistances, and the physical one is going to be a little bit more dangerous because some builds kind of run around with barely any physical damage reduction and kind of rely on avoidance and things like that, but don't worry, your avoidance layers are going to work. Things like block and evasion will actually impact that damage. And those modifiers, of course, will be based on the type of hit that you actually do. So if you do an attack, you will benefit from your own evasion on that reflected hit. And if you do an attack or a spell, the block will actually work for the type that gets reflected back to you. So for example, if you have spell block and you deal a spell, you will actually get a reflected spell back to you, and you can then block that with your spell block. However, there is one important thing to know about this change where it is quite detrimental to the player compared to the last system, and that is that because this is a flat amount of damage that's now being reflected as part of this Thorns change, if you're a player that, for example, let's say you're playing a physical damage build and you have a tiny amount of added elemental damage, how that's going to work now is that you can trigger these elemental thorns with that tiny amount of elemental damage, and you're going to take the full brunt of the thorns damage, even though you only have a tiny amount of elemental damage, whereas previously you would be able to completely ignore elemental reflect because it was such a small amount of damage. That's going to be something that you need to be aware of now. But generally speaking, you are going to have a larger window to actually react to this and not die to it. And there's also the case that some builds will kind of feel this impact more than others. Builds that only hit once every so often are only going to take one instance of the Thorns damage because that is a cap on the player side. And builds that have like lots of small hits, they probably will actually get hit quite a bit more. There is also the change right down there at the bottom that reflect modifiers no longer appear on corrupted side areas in the campaign. Keep in mind that a lot of players are going to be entering side areas in the campaign now because of the change to socket colors, and you're going to be able to use a lot of the 6 links that actually drop for you as long as you have the attributes, so that change is also relevant as well. Up next we have this change here. All classes are now able to purchase faster attacks from Nessa upon completing the Caged Brute, and all classes are now able to purchase faster casting from Yena upon completing Sharp and Cruel. That's a quest in Acts 2 there. So this change, I think, a little bit more relevant is the faster attacks change, because that means both the Witch and the Templar are going to be able to purchase faster attacks now, and that does mean they're going to be able to actually move a little bit faster with shield charge and things like that. So that is actually a really nice change. The faster casting is probably going to be relevant a little bit there for some very niche builds on those particular classes. That does mean that Ranger, Duelist and Marauder can now buy faster casting, but I think the faster attack support change is bigger. Next up is this change here. Now I wanted to pull up 2 unique item changes from the patch notes because I think these 2 are quite relevant. The first is the Grey Spire unique staff. Now this is a staff that hasn't historically been used that much, but it is quite good on the Chieftain because it grants this huge amount of global damage increase, and that's really quite good to scale the explosions from Hinekora. But this is actually being buffed a lot in this patch, so it will now roll up to 400% increased damage, and it will roll up to 5% to all maximum resistances. Do keep in mind that this staff doesn't have any sockets, that's the downside of the staff. However, it will now also have a brand new modifier on it, which just says implicit modifier magnitudes are doubled. Now that means by default, the staff will always have 50% attack block now, before it gets corrupted or anything like that. And if you corrupt or double corrupt this staff, you can potentially get some very juicy implicits on there that have their magnitude modifiers doubled. So I think that staff is really quite interesting. You do still need to get around the fact that it has no sockets though. Now the other one is Stasis Prison there. And I wanted to mention this body armor for the same reason. It now has a modifier that replaces the previous life modifier on that item for 80 to 100% increased implicit modifier magnitudes. So similar to the Grey Spire change there, you are going to have almost double the magnitude on implicit modifiers, and baseline that's just a very small mana roll on this body armor. But of course there is the vestigial unique thing in the game now, and of course there are also corrupted implicits, many of which got buffed or even new corrupted implicits got added in this patch. So there's a lot of interesting outcomes that you could get there. And the other reason why I wanted to mention the Stasis Prison change here is because this might be an indication of where this item actually comes from now. Because we know that in this patch, Legion is being changed. The Unrelenting Emblems version of the Domain of Timeless Conflict is going away, and because this has this modifier on here now, which has increased implicit modifier magnitudes, I would bet that the only way you can now get Stasis Prison is from a vestigial unique change. So actually getting it from the crystal after you've put an enshrouded body armor in there and completed the encounter. That's probably the way that you now gain the Stasis Prison body armor, which means that by default this will always have a vestigial implicit on it, and that vestigial implicit will be buffed up by that modifier. Next up is this change to avoid damage modifiers. Sources of chance to avoid all damage from hits are now additive with sources of avoiding damage from a specific damage type. So previously this wasn't the case. This is really relevant for things like the Assassin, with the elusive buff for example, that's kind of modified up with a lot of magnitude. And there are a few things in the game that grant avoidance to specific damage types. A lot of them have been kind of removed over the years, but you have things like Aspects of Stone as an anoint only node for example. That one grants 20% chance to avoid physical damage from hits. You also have the Replica Mist Wall, which can roll up to 15% chance to avoid physical damage from hits. So as an example, you could combine those two together there for up to 35% chance, and then you could also have Elusive, which grants avoid all damage from hits, and those would now stack additively together. So this change, not really relevant for a lot of things, but in particular with Assassin, especially since Assassin is getting buffed this patch and I expect to see a few more people playing it. Perhaps that will be relevant to some people wanting to play that class. And now we have a bug fix here, and I wanted to mention this one because I think it's quite important with how much the Hierophant is being played recently. And this one is fixed a bug where the 15% less physical damage taken per endurance charge removed on Immortal Call was counting minimum endurance charges which cannot be removed. And this was actually a very impactful bug. My Hierophant in 3.27 was making use of this and it was really quite strong. And you'll no longer be able to do that with the Hierophant minimum endurance charges, or indeed any minimum endurance charges that you can get. You can now only spend endurance charges that are not minimum charges, ones that you actually have gained. And lastly in this video, I want to go through a few quality of life changes that I think are really quite impactful. The first one is here. The Pit of Chimera boss now spawns only one wave of enemies per phase. This is down from 4 waves of enemies. So when comparing this boss to the other Shaper Guardian maps, this boss fight was just kind of ridiculous. It took so long. So any changes to improve that is a great change in my opinion, and this is just going to feel great. It's going to feel so much better than what it was before, so that is a really good quality of life change. There's also these monster changes here. Soul Eater now expires faster on non-players. An eaten soul is lost every 0.2 seconds if a soul has not been gained in the last 2 seconds, previously every 0.5 in the last 4. So if you're ever struggling against a Soul Eater monster, you can just kind of move yourself away from it if you can, if it's not, too fast and keeps chasing up with you. and you kind of move away from it, and it will drain those souls much, much faster. It will go at a rate of 5 souls per second, and you'll actually need to wait a lot lower time there, half the amount of time in fact, before those souls actually start draining away. So that's going to be kind of nice, especially in those early encounters in maps where some Soul Eater monsters are really quite powerful. And there's another change there, the exploding orbs from minions, Fire, Cold and Lightning explode on death rare monster modifiers now always explode after its duration, even if you're not in the area. You would have seen this when you're kind of going into a boss area when you've already killed the monsters and they have these things just ready to explode on the ground. And then when you come out of the boss area, of course, because you weren't there, the timers get stalled and they just get frozen. And then when you actually come out, they just explode on top of you. That's no longer going to be a thing. Now they will time out on their duration even if you're not in that area, and they will just expire and explode even if you're not around. And lastly, in those quality of life changes, this one is really good, and this was actually hidden away in the wrong section of the patch notes because it wasn't even in the Betrayal list of changes. The confirmation window for releasing Immortal Syndicate members can now be skipped with Ctrl-click, so no longer having that extra confirmation window come up, you can now just Ctrl-click the option, and that's it, you're done. So that's another really nice quality of life change there. And overall, even though there was kind of a ton of quality of life changes coming in and getting introduced to us in the previous patch in the lead up to the reveal and things like that, and this patch kind of didn't really feel like that, there are a lot of changes in the patch notes here that are going to improve the feeling of the game. They're also adding the little tooltip text that is in PoE 2, so you can actually pop out the tooltips and read exactly what things do. I think that's a great change. They did say that not everything is going to be ready for this patch, but they're going to slowly, over time, add all of the stuff into the game, so that is great. But hopefully, if you're watching this video, you found out something from these changes that you didn't already know about. But that's going to be it for this one. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned, and stay safe.